Mr. Wallace sat alone at a small table in the corner of a busy diner. The place was filled with laughter, the sound of plates clinking, and people chatting about their lives. But no one noticed him. He was just an old man, dressed in worn-out clothes, his shoes scuffed from years of walking. His eyes, once sharp and full of life, now looked tired. Every morning, he came to this diner. It wasn't because he loved the food. It was cheap, and he could afford only a small coffee. But it gave him a place to sit, to feel like he was still part of the world. He had served his country long ago, risking his life in dangerous places. He had stood tall, strong, and proud. But now, he was just another forgotten man. The young waitress walked past him several times without looking at him. She was smiling and laughing with other customers, taking their orders with excitement. But when she finally came to his table, her smile faded. "Are you ordering anything, or just sitting here?" she asked, tapping her notepad impatiently. "Just a coffee," Mr. Wallace said softly, reaching into his pocket for the last few coins he had. She sighed and walked away. He heard the other waitresses whispering, giggling, as if he was a joke. A group of well-dressed men and women sat at a table nearby. They were young professionals, discussing their work, their expensive cars, and their vacations. One of them glanced at Mr. Wallace and smirked. "Look at him," he whispered to his friend. "Probably just sitting here all day, doing nothing." His friend chuckled. "Some people never get their lives together." Mr. Wallace lowered his head. He wanted to tell them that he once fought for people like them, that he had spent years in harsh conditions, away from home, making sure others could live in peace. But what was the point? No one cared. The waitress returned and placed his coffee down carelessly, spilling a little onto the table. "Sorry," she said, but she didn't sound sorry at all. She hurried away before he could say anything. As he sipped his coffee, he saw a teenage boy at the counter staring at him. The boy whispered something to his friends, and they all laughed. Mr. Wallace pretended not to notice. He had been ignored for so long that he had learned to accept it. After finishing his coffee, he slowly stood up, his old bones aching. He walked toward the door, hoping to leave without drawing attention. But as he stepped outside, a group of kids ran past him, nearly knocking him over. One of them muttered, "Watch where you're going, old man." Mr. Wallace steadied himself and sighed. The world had moved on without him. No one saw him as a hero. No one even saw him at all. Mr. Wallace walked slowly down the street, his hands tucked into the pockets of his old coat. The morning air was chilly, but he barely felt it. His mind was still stuck on what had happened at the diner. He had been coming there for months, yet no one ever treated him with kindness. They either ignored him or made him feel like he didn't belong. As he reached the small park near his apartment, he sat down on a wooden bench. It was the same bench he always chose, under a large oak tree. The park was full of life. Kids playing, joggers passing by, people walking their dogs. But like always, no one paid him any attention. A man in a suit walked by, talking on his phone. He glanced at Mr. Wallace, then quickly looked away, as if he didn't want to make eye contact. A woman jogging with headphones ran past him without even noticing he was there. It was as if he was invisible. After a while, he got up and walked to the small grocery store nearby. He only needed a few things, some bread, a can of soup, and maybe a small carton of milk if he had enough money. Inside, the store was bright and full of people. He moved carefully through the aisles, picking up only what he could afford. When he reached the counter, the cashier barely looked at him. "That'll be $6.75, she said in a bored voice. Mr. Wallace reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. His hand shook slightly as he counted them. A few people behind him in line sighed impatiently. "Come on, old man," someone muttered. "I'm sorry," he said softly, trying to count faster. His fingers felt stiff from the cold. Just as he was about to hand over the money, the man behind him groaned loudly. "This is ridiculous," the man said, holding up the whole line for a couple of dollars. Mr. Wallace's face burned with embarrassment. His heart felt heavy. He had faced worse in life. Hardships, battles, loss. But somehow, small moments like these hurt the most. The cashier tapped her fingers on the counter, looking annoyed. "Sir, do you have the exact amount?" "I think so," he mumbled, finally setting the coins down. She counted them quickly, then shrugged. "Close enough." She bagged his items and pushed them toward him. He muttered a quiet "thank you" and grabbed his bag. As he turned to leave, he heard someone chuckle behind him. "Poor guy. Probably doesn't have a family to take care of him." Stepping outside, he took a deep breath, trying to push away the sadness. He had once been a man people looked up to, a man who had given everything for his country. Now he was just someone people pitied, or worse, ignored. Mr. Wallace slowly walked back to his small apartment, carrying the grocery bag in his wrinkled hands. The bag wasn't heavy, but his tired body made every step feel like an effort. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, his knees ached, and he had to stop for a moment to catch his breath. He finally reached his door and fumbled for the key in his coat pocket. The lock was old and stiff, just like everything else in his life. With a small push, the door creaked open, revealing the tiny one-room space he called home. It wasn't much, just a worn-out chair, a small table, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. The walls were bare except for a few old pictures, faded with time. He set the groceries on the table and carefully placed the bread and soup in the small cupboard. As he turned, his eyes landed on a wooden box sitting on the shelf near his bed. He walked over and lifted the lid. Inside were medals, neatly arranged, each one telling a story of bravery and sacrifice. There were also a few yellowed letters from old friends, some of whom were no longer alive. He picked up a black and white photograph of himself in his uniform. He looked strong, proud, and full of life. His eyes were sharp, his shoulders straight. That man in the picture seemed like a stranger now. What had happened to him? He sat down on his bed, holding the photo in his trembling hands. His mind drifted back to the days when he had been respected, when his service had meant something. He had fought for his country, for the freedom of people who now walked past him, as if he didn't exist. A deep sigh escaped his lips. He wasn't looking for praise. He didn't want people to bow to him or treat him like a hero. He just wanted to feel like he still mattered, like he wasn't just some forgotten old man taking up space in a world that had moved on without him. Outside, the sound of laughter echoed from the street. He stood up and walked to the window, peering outside. A group of young men stood on the corner, chatting and laughing without a care in the world. They were full of energy, full of life. He once had that same fire in his heart, but time had taken it away, little by little. He sighed again and turned away from the window. The room felt colder than before. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His eyes blinked slowly, heavy with exhaustion. He wasn't just tired from the day. He was tired of life, tired of feeling invisible. Before sleep took over, one last thought crossed his mind. Will anyone ever remember me? Would you like me to continue with part 4 in the same detailed style? The next morning, Mr. Wallace woke up to the sound of car horns outside his window. He sat up slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. Another day had begun, just like all the others. He had no plans, no one waiting for him, and nowhere important to go. He got up, washed his face in the small bathroom, and made himself a simple breakfast, a slice of bread and a cup of tea. As he sat down to eat, he heard voices outside. Curious, he walked to the window and looked down. A sleek black SUV was parked near his building. It was different from the usual old cars that lined the street. The vehicle had tinted windows, and its polished surface shone under the morning sun. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out, looking around as if searching for something or someone. Mr. Wallace frowned. It wasn't every day that a car like that appeared in his neighborhood. He watched as the man checked a small notepad and then spoke to a younger man standing near the building entrance. After a brief conversation, the suited man looked up, directly at Mr. Wallace's window. A strange feeling ran through Mr. Wallace. Was this a mistake? Why would someone like that be looking for him? Before he could think further, there was a knock at his door. He hesitated. No one ever visited him. His hands felt shaky as he reached for the doorknob and slowly pulled it open. Standing there was the same man from outside, tall, serious-looking, and neatly dressed. He held a file in one hand and looked directly at Mr. Wallace with deep respect in his eyes. "Mr. Wallace?" the man asked in a formal voice. "Yes," Wallace replied cautiously. "My name is Mr. Carter. I've been sent here to pick you up." Mr. Wallace blinked in surprise. "Pick me up? Why? Who sent you?" "I can't say much here," Mr. Carter said. "But please, come with me. Everything will be explained once we reach our destination." Mr. Wallace hesitated. This didn't make sense. He had no family, no close friends, who would send a car for him. His life had been the same for years, forgotten and ignored. Why now? As if sensing his doubt, Mr. Carter spoke again. "Sir, I assure you, this is not a mistake. You are being invited somewhere important, somewhere where you are valued." Mr. Wallace looked at the man's face. There was no hint of a joke, no sign of trickery. He took a deep breath, glanced around his small, lonely apartment, and then slowly nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll come." Mr. Carter stepped aside, letting Mr. Wallace walk past him. As they headed down the stairs, the black SUV's door opened. Mr. Wallace climbed in, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Something was about to change. But what? Mr. Wallace sat quietly in the back seat of the black SUV as it smoothly drove through the city streets. The car's interior was clean, comfortable, and nothing like the old buses he usually rode. The soft hum of the engine and the cool air from the vents made him feel oddly calm, yet his mind was racing with questions. He glanced at the man sitting beside him. Mr. Carter. He had a professional look, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression serious but not unkind. Wallace cleared his throat, deciding to break the silence. "So, where are we going?" he asked. Mr. Carter turned to him with a small smile. "You'll see soon, sir. But I can tell you this, there are people waiting for you, people who respect and appreciate everything you've done." Wallace frowned. "People waiting for me? I don't understand. I've been alone for years." "I know," Mr. Carter said, "and that's why today it is important." The veteran looked out the window as the car moved through different parts of the city. They passed through busy streets, then quieter neighborhoods, until finally they entered a gated area. The guards at the entrance saluted as the SUV passed, making Wallace even more confused. The car pulled up in front of a grand building with tall glass windows and a large entrance. Mr. Carter stepped out first, then opened the door for Wallace. He hesitated for a moment, feeling out of place in his worn-out clothes. But there was no turning back now. As he stepped outside, he saw a group of people standing near the entrance, men and women in formal suits, military officers in decorated uniforms. The moment they saw him, they straightened up and saluted. Wallace stopped, his breath catching in his throat. No one had saluted him in decades. A high-ranking officer stepped forward, an older man with sharp eyes and silver hair. He extended his hand. "Mr. Wallace, it is an honor to finally meet you," the officer said. "Please, come inside. We have been waiting for this day." Still in shock, Wallace shook the man's hand. His grip was strong, respectful. Slowly, he followed them into the building, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that it was something big. Inside, the hall was filled with framed pictures, historical documents, and medals displayed in glass cases. It looked like a place where heroes were remembered. One of the officers gestured toward a large screen. "We have something to show you." The screen flickered to life, and suddenly, Wallace saw his own face, younger, full of life, standing in his uniform. Old footage played, showing him and his fellow soldiers in the past, moments he had almost forgotten. His heart pounded as he realized someone had been watching. Someone had been remembering. Tears welled up in his eyes. After so many years of being ignored, his story was about to be told. Would you like me to continue with part 6 in the same style? Mr. Wallace sat in a large hall, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The old black and white footage played slowly, showing images from long ago. Soldiers standing together, marching in the heat of battle, carrying their wounded brothers to safety. And there he was, younger, stronger, proud. The footage showed him in his uniform, leading his team through the rough terrain. His voice, though aged by time, still carried power as he gave orders. He saw himself running to help a fallen soldier, carrying him on his back through gunfire. He saw moments he had long forgotten, moments that had once defined his life. The room was silent, filled with military officials, historians, and reporters. No one spoke as the video continued. Then, one by one, more pictures appeared, official documents, medals awarded in his name, letters of honor. His name was written in bold letters on a large banner behind the screen. Sergeant Wallace, a forgotten hero. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling like his sacrifices had meant nothing. But here, in this grand hall, surrounded by people who truly understood, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. The officer who had greeted him earlier, General Reynolds, stood up and cleared his throat. "Sergeant Wallace," he said, his voice firm but full of respect, "we have brought you here today because your story should never have been forgotten. You fought bravely for this country, and it is time we give you the recognition you deserve." Wallace looked down at his hands, rough and wrinkled from time. He had never expected anything like this. He had accepted that people had moved on, that his name would fade away. But now it was being brought back into the light. A younger officer stepped forward, holding a beautifully framed certificate. "Sir," he said with a smile, "this is for you. The Lifetime Service Award for your dedication and bravery." The entire room stood up and clapped. The sound was overwhelming. Mr. Wallace, who had spent years being ignored, was now the center of attention. He slowly stood, his legs shaking slightly, not from weakness, but from emotion. He accepted the certificate with both hands, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything, sir," General Reynolds said. "Just know that we remember, and we are grateful." For the first time in years, Mr. Wallace smiled, a real, genuine smile. He was not forgotten. Not anymore. Mr. Wallace stood in the grand hall, holding the framed Lifetime Service Award in his trembling hands. The applause filled the room, echoing in his ears. It was a sound he had not heard in decades, a sound of respect, of gratitude. His heart felt full, something he had not experienced in a long time. After the applause died down, General Reynolds stepped forward once more. "Sergeant Wallace, we would like to honor you not just with this award, but with something more, something permanent." Wallace looked at him in confusion. "Permanent?" he asked softly. General Reynolds gestured toward the side of the hall, where a red curtain covered part of the wall. A young officer stepped forward and pulled the curtain aside, revealing a large framed portrait of Mr. Wallace in his military uniform. Below the portrait, a golden plaque bore his name along with the words, "Sergeant Wallace, a true patriot, a forgotten hero remembered." Wallace's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as he stared at the portrait, unable to believe what he was seeing. "This will be displayed in our National Military Museum," General Reynolds continued. "Your story, your bravery, and your sacrifices will never be forgotten again." Tears welled up in Wallace's eyes. He had lived his later years in loneliness, thinking that no one cared. But here, in this moment, surrounded by officers, historians, and reporters, He knew that his life had mattered. A young soldier approached him and saluted. "Sir, I've read about your missions. You inspired me to join the military. It's an honor to meet you." Wallace blinked, taken aback. You know about my missions." "Yes, sir," the young man said with a proud smile. "Your leadership, your courage, it's legendary." Wallace looked around the room. More young officers nodded in agreement. Some had even read old reports about him. A few reporters took pictures, capturing the moment forever. Mr. Carter, the man who had brought him here, stepped beside him. "You see, sir," he said in a gentle voice, "you were never forgotten. People just needed a reminder of your greatness." Wallace chuckled softly, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I never thought I'd see this day." "You deserve it, sir," General Reynolds said firmly. A grand dinner was arranged that evening in his honor. Wallace sat at the head table, surrounded by people who respected him. He was not invisible anymore. He was no longer just an old man sitting alone in a park. As he ate, laughed, and shared stories from his past, he realized something important. His life had meaning. And now, everyone knew it. Would you like me to continue with Part 8 in the same style? The evening was filled with warmth, laughter, and deep respect for Mr. Wallace. He sat at the grand dinner table, surrounded by military officers, historians, and young soldiers who looked at him with admiration. For the first time in years, he felt alive. People asked him about his time in the service, eager to hear his stories. At first, he hesitated. It had been so long since anyone cared to listen. But as the conversations continued, he found himself speaking more, his voice growing stronger. He shared moments of courage, of fear, of friendship forged in battle. Some stories made people laugh, while others brought silence as they realized the hardships he had endured. "You never gave up," one young officer said, shaking his head in awe. "Even in the toughest times, you kept fighting." Wallace smiled. "A soldier never truly fights for medals," he said. "He fights for the man standing next to him. That's what keeps you going." The young officer nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Later that night, General Reynolds stood up and tapped his glass, signaling for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight we have honored a true hero, a man who gave his best years for his country, yet was forgotten by the world. That ends today." Everyone clapped in agreement. "Sergeant Wallace," the general continued, turning to him, "we would like to offer you something else. A place to stay among fellow veterans. A home where you will never be alone again." Wallace's heart skipped a beat. A home. A place where he belonged. The general continued, "It's a beautiful residence, built for those who have served. You'll be surrounded by men and women who share your experiences, who understand your sacrifices. No more struggling alone. You will be with family." Wallace felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so many years in a tiny apartment, forgotten by the world. The idea of having a real home, with people who cared, felt almost unbelievable. You would do that for me?" he asked, his voice shaky. "You did so much for us," the general said. "This is the least we can do for you." Tears welled up in Wallace's eyes, but this time, they were not from sadness. They were from gratitude. He had expected to live the rest of his life in loneliness, but tonight, everything had changed. The crowd stood and clapped once more. Wallace, overwhelmed with emotion, stood up and saluted. The room fell silent for a brief moment before every officer, young and old, returned the salute. It was a moment of honor, respect, and recognition. As the night ended, Mr. Wallace stepped outside, looking up at the stars. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He was no longer forgotten. He was finally home.